December 18th, 1944. Ardennes Forest, eastern Belgium. Snow fell in thick curtains across the frozen pine forest as Obergefreiter Ernst Weber pressed himself against the frost-hardened earth, breath forming clouds in the pre-dawn darkness. His unit, Volksgrenadier Division 276, had been advancing through these woods for 3 days, part of Hitler's desperate gamble to split the Allied armies and reach Antwerp. They had driven the Americans back, reclaimed villages, watched enemy units scatter in confusion. The offensive had felt, for those first intoxicating days, like 1940 again. Like the Wehrmacht was unstoppable, like German arms would prevail through superior tactics and fighting spirit. But now, in the gray half-light before sunrise, Weber and his squad had encountered something that changed the mathematics of infantry warfare. From a ridgeline 800 meters distant, a sound erupted that Weber had never heard before. Not the rapid cycling bark of a German MG-42, not the lighter chatter of American .30 caliber Brownings, but something deeper, slower, more deliberate. A rhythmic hammering that seemed to shake the frozen air itself, each report distinct and massive, like a blacksmith's anvil struck at measured intervals. The sound was accompanied by impacts that tore through the pine forest with explosive force, trees splintering at chest height, branches exploding in showers of frozen wood, snow erupting in geysers where rounds struck the earth. And then the sound reached Weber's position, and he understood. The heavy rounds weren't just passing through cover, they were erasing it. The log he had sheltered behind disintegrated, the frozen wood offering no more protection than paper. The stone wall beyond shattered, fragments spinning away. The sound of the weapon was matched by the sound of destruction, and in that moment, Weber realized his squad was being engaged by something his training had not prepared him to face. This was not suppressive fire meant to keep heads down. This was annihilation fire, meant to reach through any protection infantry might use, delivered from ranges where German weapons were ineffective, sustained with an ammunition supply that seemed inexhaustible. The Americans had brought the M2 Browning .50 caliber machine gun to the infantry fight, and the rules of engagement Weber had learned were suddenly obsolete. The German Wehrmacht had entered the Second World War with arguably the finest general-purpose machine gun ever designed, the MG-42. Capable of firing up to 1,500 rounds per minute, the weapon earned the nickname Hitler's buzzsaw from Allied troops who learned to recognize and fear its distinctive sound. German infantry doctrine was built around the MG-42, with rifle squads organized to support and protect the machine gun rather than the other way round. The weapon provided devastating suppressive fire at ranges up to 1,000 meters, could be fired from bipod or tripod mounts, and used a quick-change barrel system that allowed sustained fire without overheating. German soldiers trained with the MG-42 took pride in their weapon. It represented German engineering excellence, the marriage of high fire rate and reliability that made Wehrmacht infantry squads the most lethal man-for-man forces in Europe. When German troops encountered American forces in North Africa, Italy, and France, they had noted the Americans' reliance on the .30 caliber M1919 Browning A decent weapon, but clearly inferior to the MG-42 in fire rate and intimidation factor. The assumption within German ranks was that American small arms technology lagged behind German innovation, that American infantry relied on numbers and artillery support rather than superior weapons. This assumption was reinforced by captured American equipment, by battlefield observations, by the general sense that Germany's industrial expertise in precision manufacturing gave it an edge in small arms development. But the assumption was incomplete. The Americans had something else, something German infantry rarely encountered in the early years of the war because it was primarily used in anti-aircraft and vehicle-mounted roles. The M2 Browning 50 caliber machine gun had been designed in 1933, refined throughout the 1930s, and by 1944 was being produced at rates exceeding 2,000 units per day. And increasingly, American forces were deploying it in ground combat roles where its capabilities fundamentally changed what infantry units could achieve. Weber's introduction to the M2 had been catastrophic and educational in equal measure. His squad had been advancing on what intelligence reported as a lightly defended American position, a crossroads held by elements of the 99th Infantry Division that had been retreating for days. The plan was textbook Wehrmacht tactics: suppress the position with MG-42 fire from 800 meters, advance under that suppression, close to assault range, overwhelm with grenades and close combat, where German training and experience provided advantage. Weber's MG-42 team had opened fire first, the weapon's 1,200 round per minute cyclic rate tearing through the winter air in long, controlled bursts. They watched their tracers arc toward the American position, saw impacts in the tree line, felt the satisfaction of executing doctrine correctly. And then the Americans replied. The first indication was the sound. That deep, measured hammering that was nothing like any machine gun Weber had heard. Then came the impacts, and Weber's understanding of battlefield geometry collapsed. The rounds weren't just reaching his position, they were arriving with velocity that defied his assumptions about what machine gun fire could do at 800 meters. The MG-42 team beside him simply ceased to exist. The gun shield, which would stop rifle rounds and MG-42 bullets, was punched through as if it were tin foil. The gunner and assistant gunner went down instantly, their position transformed from an effective firing point to a debris field in the span of 3 seconds. Weber, 20 meters away, behind what he thought was solid cover, watched frozen clods of earth explode around him as rounds that had passed through trees arrived with enough energy to excavate the ground. One round struck the tree he was using for cover at a 45-degree angle, struck it, not embedded in it, and continued through 3 more trees before expending its energy. The physics of it seemed wrong. Machine gun bullets weren't supposed to do that. But the M2 .50 caliber BMG Browning machine gun round wasn't a rifle bullet scaled up. It was a fundamentally different projectile, a 700-grain round leaving the barrel at 2,900 feet per second, carrying more than 3 times the energy of the MG-42's 8mm Mauser round. At 800 meters, a range where MG-42 fire was losing energy and accuracy, the .50 BMG round was still supersonic, still carrying devastating kinetic force, still capable of penetrating any cover available to infantry. The engagement lasted 7 minutes. In that time, Weber's platoon lost 18 men killed and another dozen wounded.
The American position, which they had never closed to within 600 meters of, remained intact and apparently unharmed by the MG-42 fire that had been poured into it. When the order to withdraw came, Weber and the survivors pulled back through the forest, dragging wounded, abandoning equipment that couldn't be moved quickly.
Behind them, the M2 continued its measured hammering, rounds cracking through the air above their retreat, occasionally finding targets even as the range opened beyond 1,000 meters. Weber had been in combat since 1942, had fought across Russia and France, had faced Soviet heavy machine guns and American rifle fire. Nothing had prepared him for this, for a weapon that made cover meaningless, that delivered lethal fire from ranges where return fire was ineffective, that seemed to have unlimited ammunition and the mechanical reliability to fire continuously without degradation. That night, in a commandeered barn serving as a temporary assembly area, Weber's company commander held an informal briefing for squad leaders who had survived the day's engagements. The captain, a veteran of the Eastern Front with a Knight's Cross earned at Kursk, stood before a map and spoke with unusual bluntness. "The Americans have been using their heavy machine guns against our positions throughout the offensive. We have reports from every regiment, casualties from direct fire at ranges exceeding 800 meters, positions suppressed by weapons our MG-42s cannot effectively engage, armored vehicles providing mobile fire support that our infantry weapons cannot counter. The weapon is the M2 Browning, caliber .50, and it operates in a range and penetration envelope we cannot match with squad-level weapons." Someone asked about the MG-42's superiority in fire rate. The captain's response was tired but honest. "Fire rate is irrelevant if your rounds cannot reach the target with lethal energy. The Americans are engaging us from ranges where our machine guns are marginally effective, while their heavy machine guns are delivering precision fire that penetrates any cover available to infantry. They are not fighting our battle. They are fighting their battle, and we are dying in it." The M2 Browning had entered American service in 1933, developed by John Browning as a scaled-up version of his earlier .30 caliber machine gun designs. The weapon was designed primarily for anti-aircraft and vehicle-mounted roles, intended to engage aircraft, light armored vehicles, and fortified positions with the kind of heavy firepower that rifle-caliber weapons couldn't deliver. The .50 BMG cartridge it fired was developed specifically to penetrate aircraft aluminum and engine blocks at range, using a combination of projectile mass, velocity, and hardened penetrator cores. By 1944, the M2 had evolved through multiple refinements into a weapon of exceptional reliability and accuracy. The gun weighed 84 pounds without its tripod, fired from a 110-round belt, and could sustain rates of fire around 500 rounds per minute, far slower than the MG-42, but far more powerful per round. The weapon's maximum effective range against personnel was listed as 1,800 meters, though skilled gunners regularly engaged targets beyond 2,000 meters. Against light vehicles and fortifications, it remained effective to 2,500 meters. The penetration was extraordinary. The M2 could punch through 30 millimeters of rolled homogeneous armor at 500 meters, could penetrate standard infantry cover, including log walls, stone barriers, and earth berms with ease, could disable or destroy light vehicles that were immune to rifle-caliber fire. American forces had initially used the M2 primarily in anti-aircraft mounts on vehicles and in fixed defensive positions. But as the war progressed, and American industry's massive production capacity delivered weapons in quantities that allowed tactical experimentation,
Infantry commanders began deploying M2s in ground combat roles where their capabilities fundamentally altered the tactical picture. The transformation in American tactics became apparent during the Battle of the Bulge. Facing German infantry attacks that relied on infiltration, fire and maneuver, and close assault, American units began positioning M2s on dominant terrain where the weapon's range and penetration could be fully utilized. The results were devastating for German attackers. Where German doctrine assumed they could advance under MG-42 suppressive fire to within assault range, they found themselves engaged by .50 caliber fire that shredded their covering positions from ranges where their own weapons were ineffective. Stone walls that would stop MG-42 rounds were penetrated by .50 BMG ammunition. Log bunkers that provided immunity from rifle fire were torn apart. Earth berms had to be unrealistically thick to stop the heavy rounds. And the psychological impact was as significant as the physical casualties. German soldiers who had learned to recognize the sound of different weapons and estimate danger based on those sounds found the M2's deep, rhythmic hammering to be uniquely terrifying. Unlike the MG-42's rapid buzz or the M1919's lighter chatter, the M2 announced each round individually, each impact audible and massive. Soldiers described it as hearing their death approach one round at a time, knowing that if the gunner walked his fire onto their position, no cover they possessed would save them.
Weber experienced this psychological dimension during a night infiltration attempt on December 22nd. His squad had been tasked with approaching an American position under cover of darkness, using a ravine for concealment, planning to assault at first light. They moved carefully, silently, professional infantry executing a difficult mission with the competence earned through years of combat. At 400 meters from the American line, an M2 opened fire. The gunner couldn't possibly see them in the darkness. He was firing on speculation, putting rounds into likely approach routes and dead ground where German infantry might be hiding. But the speculation was educated, and the ammunition seemed unlimited. The .50 caliber rounds tore through the ravine, ricocheting off rocks, excavating frozen earth, creating a zone of destruction that made movement suicidal and staying in place nearly as dangerous. For 15 minutes, the M2 hammered the approach routes, the gunner traversing slowly back and forth, firing in measured bursts that suggested discipline and unlimited ammunition supply. Weber's squad hugged the frozen ground, pressed into whatever minimal depressions they could find, and endured. 3 men were hit, not killed immediately, but wounded badly enough that they couldn't move silently. When the M2 finally ceased fire, the mission was over. They withdrew, carrying wounded, having never engaged the enemy, having never fired a shot. The M2 had won the tactical engagement through pure suppression, through the threat of violence so overwhelming that it paralyzed a veteran infantry squad. The technical superiority of the M2 was matched by logistical superiority that German forces couldn't counter. The weapon consumed ammunition at prodigious rates. A single M2 could fire 500 rounds in a minute, nearly 30,000 rounds in an hour if ammunition was available and barrel changes were executed properly.
German intelligence officers examining captured American positions found ammunition stockpiles that would have supplied a German infantry company for a week, concentrated at single M2 positions. Belt after belt of .50 BMG ammunition, stored in metal cans, ready for immediate use. The Americans weren't rationing their heavy machine gun fire. They were using it liberally, almost carelessly by German standards, suppressing suspected positions, engaging targets of opportunity, firing on speculation whenever tactical sense suggested enemies might be present. This profligacy was possible because American industrial production had made .50 BMG ammunition essentially unlimited. Factories in the United States were producing ammunition at rates that German logistics officers couldn't comprehend, billions of rounds annually, transported across the Atlantic by convoy, distributed through supply networks that delivered ammunition to frontline units faster than they could expend it. A single American infantry division in December 1944 had more .50 caliber ammunition in its supply trains than the entire German Army Group B had for all calibers combined. The disparity wasn't just in weapons, it was in the entire industrial and logistical system that made those weapons effective. German forces fighting in the Ardennes were rationing MG-42 ammunition, training gunners to fire in short, precise bursts, conserving every round because resupply was uncertain and stockpiles were limited. American M2 gunners were trained to fire until the target was suppressed or destroyed, to use ammunition freely, to trust that supply would always exceed consumption. The psychological impact of this disparity on German infantry was corrosive and cumulative. Weber survived the Battle of the Bulge, though his unit did not survive as a fighting force. By early January 1945, the Volksgrenadier Division 276 had been reduced to less than battalion strength, its infantry companies amalgamated into understrength platoons, its heavy weapons companies stripped of equipment destroyed in combat or abandoned during retreats. In February, Weber was transferred to a replacement battalion being formed in Western Germany, a collection of veterans, recovered wounded, and barely trained recruits being organized for defensive operations against the anticipated Allied push across the Rhine. The training cadre included several officers and NCOs who had fought in the Ardennes, and their instruction focused heavily on American tactics and weapons. The sessions on the M2 Browning were unusually detailed and unusually pessimistic. The instructors explained the weapon's range, penetration, and rate of fire. They demonstrated with captured examples how the gun operated, how it was sighted and fired, how American doctrine employed it. They showed examples of the damage .50 caliber rounds inflicted on various materials: wood, stone, steel, earth. They emphasized that the M2 created a tactical problem German infantry doctrine had no effective answer for. Standard German infantry squad weapons, rifles, the MP-40 submachine gun, the MG-42 and Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons all operated at ranges under 600 meters effectively. The M2 operated effectively to 1,800 meters. This range differential meant American forces could position M2s on terrain where they dominated approaches and killing zones while remaining immune to German return fire, except from heavy weapons like mortars or anti-tank guns. And American forces, with their abundant vehicle transport, could reposition M2s quickly when threatened, maintaining range advantage and denying German forces the close combat where Wehrmacht training and experience might provide an edge. The instructors were frank about the implications. German infantry would have to accept casualties from M2 fire as a cost of operations, would have to develop tactics that minimized exposure to the weapon's engagement envelope, would have to rely more heavily on night operations and covered approaches where the M2's range advantage was negated. But underlying all the tactical discussion was a recognition that the M2 represented something more than a superior weapon. It represented an industrial capacity and logistical system that Germany could no longer match. The M2 Browning became, for German infantry who encountered it repeatedly, a symbol of American material abundance in the same way the proximity fuse and P-47 engine represented abundance to Japanese and German engineers. The weapon itself was technically impressive, but not revolutionary. It was a scaled-up machine gun design, using established principles. What made it devastating in combat was the context in which it was employed. American forces used M2s freely because they had thousands of them, because ammunition was unlimited, because doctrine didn't require conservation of resources, because the entire supply chain from factory to front line functioned with efficiency that kept weapons fed and fighting. German forces, even when they captured M2s, which happened occasionally, couldn't employ them effectively in sustained combat because ammunition was scarce, because spare parts were unavailable, because their logistics system was collapsing under strategic bombing and resource depletion. A captured M2 might fire a few hundred rounds before its ammunition was exhausted, and then it became a useless trophy rather than a functional weapon. The Americans could afford to use the M2 as a squad-level support weapon, mounting it on jeeps for mobile fire support, and placing it in defensive positions in numbers that seemed wasteful to German observers, firing thousands of rounds to suppress positions that might or might not contain enemies. This wasn't tactical proficiency, it was industrial abundance applied to warfare, and the result was a type of combat that German tactical excellence couldn't overcome.
Weber's final encounter with the M2 came in March 1945 during the defense of a Rhine River crossing near Wessel. His understrength platoon had been positioned in a village on the river's east bank, tasked with delaying American forces long enough for engineer units to prepare defensive positions further inland. The Americans crossed the Rhine at dawn on March 24th, their assault supported by artillery barrages that reduced the village to rubble before the 1st Infantry arrived.
Weber's position, a reinforced basement beneath a collapsed building, survived the initial bombardment, and his squad prepared to engage American infantry advancing through the ruins. They had a good position with overlapping fields of fire, an MG-42 positioned to cover the main approach, rifle positions covering alternate routes. By the standards of late-war German defensive tactics, it was well conceived and properly executed. The Americans didn't advance into the killing zone. Instead, 2 M2 Brownings positioned on the west bank of the Rhine, nearly 900 meters distant, began systematically destroying Weber's defensive position. The gunners couldn't see into the basement where Weber's squad sheltered, but they didn't need to. They fired into the rubble pile, their .50 caliber rounds punching through the broken masonry, ricocheting through the basement, filling the confined space with fragments and impacts. The MG-42 position, protected by rubble that would have stopped any rifle-caliber weapon, was penetrated and destroyed. The assistant gunner was killed by a round that went through 3 walls before striking him. The squad's rifle positions became untenable as the M2s traversed back and forth, their fire methodical and sustained, turning the entire village into a beaten zone where survival was more luck than tactical skill. After 30 minutes of this destruction, American infantry advanced into the village without encountering resistance. Weber's squad had withdrawn through prepared routes, abandoning the position without inflicting casualties on the enemy, their defensive mission negated by weapons that operated at ranges and with penetration that made physical cover inadequate. Weber and 3 others surrendered to American forces that afternoon, emerging from a drainage culvert with hands raised, exhausted, and past the point of resistance.
His war ended not with a climactic battle, but with a recognition that continuing to fight was tactically pointless. The Americans had weapons, ammunition, and logistical support that made infantry combat a one-sided affair where German tactical skill was simply overwhelmed by material superiority. In prisoner of war camps, German infantry veterans compared experiences and reached informal consensus about American weapons and tactics. The M2 Browning was consistently rated as the most psychologically effective weapon Americans employed at infantry level. More feared than tanks because it was more common, more terrifying than artillery because its fire was direct and personal, more dangerous than rifles because it made cover meaningless. German soldiers who had fought on the Eastern Front against Soviet forces compared the M2 unfavorably to any weapon they had faced in Russia. Soviet heavy machine guns had better penetration than rifle-caliber weapons, but nothing approached the M2's combination of range, penetration, reliability, and unlimited ammunition supply. The weapon represented American warfare in microcosm, not particularly elegant or innovative, but effective through systematic application of overwhelming resources, executed with logistical efficiency that sustained combat power over time. One German officer, a company commander who had fought in North Africa, Italy, and France before his capture in April 1945, wrote in his post-war memoir, "We feared the M2 not because it was a brilliant weapon. It was simply a large machine gun, but because it represented everything we couldn't match. Every time we encountered it, we were reminded that the Americans could afford to deploy such weapons at squad level, could afford to fire thousands of rounds without concern for conservation, could afford to use heavy machine guns in roles we reserved for artillery. The weapon's effectiveness was inseparable from the industrial system that produced it and the logistics that sustained it. We were fighting 1940s war with 1940s resources. They were fighting 1945's war with unlimited resources. The M2 was the proof of that disparity, delivered at 2,900 feet per second. The post-war analysis of small arms effectiveness consistently rated the M2 Browning as one of the most significant weapons of the Second World War, not for any revolutionary technical innovation, but for its role in establishing American tactical dominance at the infantry level. The weapon remained in American service long after the war. Indeed, it remains in service today, fundamentally unchanged from its 1933 design, a testament to the soundness of its engineering. German attempts to develop equivalent weapons during the war, heavy machine guns in 13mm or 15mm caliber, never progressed beyond prototype stages because German industry lacked the capacity to tool up production while simultaneously maintaining output of existing weapon systems. The resource allocation required to design, test, produce, and deploy a new heavy machine gun couldn't be justified when existing production lines were barely meeting demand for standard weapons. The M2's dominance was therefore not just technical, but systemic. It existed because American industry could afford to produce it at scale, because American logistics could deliver it and its ammunition to frontline units in quantity, because American doctrine could absorb a weapon that consumed resources at rates German forces couldn't sustain. The psychological impact on German infantry was to reinforce the growing recognition that the war was lost, that tactical excellence and fighting spirit couldn't overcome material disparity of the magnitude the M2 represented.
Each engagement with the weapon was a reminder that Germany was fighting opponents who operated in a different economic universe, who could afford profligacy where Germany required conservation, who measured their industrial output in abundance where Germany measured in scarcity.
March 1945. Weber stood in a prisoner of war camp in Belgium, watching American trucks deliver supplies to the compound. The logistics were casual, almost wasteful. Crates stacked carelessly, guards smoking and laughing. A sense of abundance so complete that nothing needed to be conserved or protected or rationed. In the distance, he could hear the sound that had haunted his final months of combat. The deep, measured hammering of an M2 Browning, probably being test-fired or zeroed at a nearby range. The sound no longer held terror now that he was behind the wire, but it still carried meaning. That sound was the voice of industrial warfare, the audio signature of a nation that could manufacture complexity at scale, that could turn steel and precision engineering into tools of war and then produce those tools in quantities that made them disposable. The M2 wasn't the best machine gun in the world by every metric. The MG-42 had a higher rate of fire. Soviet weapons were more robust in extreme conditions, but the M2 was the most effective weapon in its class because effectiveness wasn't measured purely in technical specifications. It was measured in the ability to deliver firepower consistently, at range, with penetration that defeated protection, sustained by logistics that never failed, multiplied across thousands of infantry units. The weapon was a teacher wrapped in steel and heavy rounds, offering lessons about the nature of modern warfare that arrived too late for Germany to apply. Wars between industrial nations were decided by factories and supply chains, by the ability to produce not just adequate weapons, but overwhelming quantities of superior weapons, by logistics systems that kept those weapons functioning under combat conditions. Excellence in design meant nothing without excellence in production. Excellence in production meant nothing without excellence in logistics. The Americans had achieved all three, and the M2 Browning was the proof, firing across battlefields from ranges German weapons couldn't match, penetrating cover German infantry relied upon, sustained by ammunition supplies German logistics officers could only imagine. The sound of that distant M2 was the sound of lessons learned too late, truths recognized when they could no longer save lives or change outcomes. The war had been lost in factories and on production lines, in shipping manifests and supply dumps, in the fundamental capacity to translate national wealth into military power at scales that made tactical brilliance irrelevant. The M2 was simply the messenger, delivering that truth in .5 caliber messages that penetrated every illusion and every defensive position, leaving behind only the recognition that courage and skill were necessary but insufficient. The massive machine gun was a monument to American industrial abundance, engineered for reliability rather than elegance, built to win through overwhelming application of resources rather than through tactical innovation. And against such abundance, against such systematic superiority of means, determination and fighting spirit were just elaborate forms of delay. The deep hammering in the distance continued, steady and unhurried, mechanical perfection sustained by industrial systems that had no equivalent on the other side. Weber listened and understood finally what he had been fighting against all along. Not better soldiers, not superior tactics, but a nation that could afford to put 84-pound machine guns in jeeps, that could feed them unlimited ammunition, that could employ them so casually that their presence was routine rather than exceptional. The sound was the voice of that nation rendered in gunfire and steel, speaking truths about the nature of power in the industrial age.
And Germany had learned those truths through blood and defeat, through encounters with weapons like the M2 that operated in envelopes German doctrine couldn't address and German resources couldn't match. The war had taught its lessons thoroughly. The M2's hammering was simply the exclamation point.